Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a one-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
Hello and welcome to Gabfest Reads for the month of November. I'm Emily Bazelon, one of the hosts of Slate's Political Gabfest. We are here to talk about The Icon and the Idealist by Stephanie Gorton. Hey, Stephanie.
Hi, Emily. Thanks for having me.
So glad you're here. So your book tells the story of two women who helped bring birth control to the United States. One of them you've probably heard of, Margaret Sanger, who opened the first birth control clinics in the U.S. and started Planned Parenthood Federation of America. And the second main character in your book, Stephanie, is Mary Ware Dennett, whose trial in 1929 for writing a booklet about sex education was a landmark victory for free speech and civil rights. And Dennett also very much for years worked on making birth control legal. So just to set this up a little bit more, you write that through the hands of Dennett and Sanger, contraception went from radical fringe to the pages of the Ladies' Home Journal and Fortune. From esoteric to mainstream, from the sawdust floor bars of Greenwich Village to the tea tables of Connecticut and beyond. Birth control became not just decent, but emblematic of safety, responsibility, and common sense. And we should locate this in time. The period in which this transition takes place is the first few decades of the 20th century. So we're going back 100 years or more. Can you start us off by painting portraits of these two women? For starters, who is Mary Ware Dennett, and what happens to her that makes her defy all the conventions of her time to become a champion of birth control in the 1910s and 1920s?
So Dennett's really a fascinating figure who should be better known, and her story of how she came to the birth control movement, I think, is really a case study in what was happening to so many American women at that time. She didn't grow up with money, but she came from a very intellectual Boston family and became an artist and designer and professor. After she married an architect, she and her husband worked side by side. He designing houses, she would do the interiors. And they had this very kind of progressive, almost utopian marriage and vision of how they wanted to live their lives. When they got married in their marriage ceremony, they omitted the word obey, which is something more and more young people were doing at that time. But then the crisis really came for them when they started having children, which happened pretty much right away in their first year of marriage. They had 3 boys very close together. And for Mary, her births were all unusually protracted and physically traumatic. She was left with birth injuries that would not heal. She probably had a fistula, which is like a extra cavity that opens in the genital region. And without surgery and time, she would not have recovered at all. After her second birth, the baby did not thrive and she was unable to breastfeed. He was unable to take any other kind of formula or milk, and he died of malnutrition when he was 3 weeks old. And despite that, she pretty quickly got pregnant again. And after that third birth, after that third little boy, doctors told the Dennetts they needed to stop having children, that another pregnancy could be fatal for her. There was no birth control advice attached to this recommendation. So the Dennetts just stopped having sex. Their physical relationship was over. Within a couple of years, Dennett's husband had drifted into a relationship with one of his architecture clients. And he invited Mary to actually form a combined household with this other couple. And their divorce was very scandalous because he was open about how this is what his spirit needed, how it was his fullest self-realization to be with this other woman, and how dearly he wanted his wife to come with him too. She ended up, because his behavior was seen as so scandalous at the time, and the divorce was tabloid fodder in the Boston press. But she ended up with sole custody of her 2 sons and no help at all in supporting them. That's really what turned her to activism, because just to make a living, she began working for the National Women's Suffrage headquarters in New York City. That became her training in the world of activism, of lobbying, of propaganda, of coordinating regional movements into one bigger national movement. But when she wasn't working there, she was part of this secretive feminist club called Heterodoxy. And one day in 1914, she heard Margaret Sanger give a lecture there about birth control, and she was galvanized. Soon after that, she decides to devote her life to birth control, and she helped launch the National Birth Control League, which is the first national birth control organization, followed by the Voluntary Parenthood League. And between 1919 and 1924, she became the first person to ever bring reproductive rights to Washington. She lobbied Congress to legalize birth control.
So let me ask you a similar question about Margaret Sanger. Who was she and what drove her toward birth control as her life's work?
Sanger came from a really different background from Dennett, which is part of what makes the story so interesting. She was from a large, poor Irish family in upstate New York. She was the sixth of 11 surviving children. And though she didn't talk too much about her mother later in her life, my theory is that that was one of the formative experiences growing up alongside her mother, who, in addition to those 11 children, had at least 7 miscarriages. So she was pregnant or nursing for the majority of her roughly 30 years of marriage. She also suffered from TB, which was exacerbated by these relentless pregnancies, and she died when she was barely 50. So Sanger trained as a nurse and married, also an architect, and moved to downtown Manhattan. And she and her husband became involved with the radical socialist scene. She became a visiting nurse in tenement neighborhoods on the Lower East Side. And it was there where she repeatedly saw women who were injured or dying as a result of self-induced abortion attempts, that she decided to write a birth control guide. She developed the ambition to open a birth control clinic. And eventually she launched her own lobbying campaign in Congress to rival Dennett's.
You mentioned that Dennett founded the National Birth Control League, and she's part of this very intensely committed small group of women. What exactly is their agenda? What are they trying to accomplish? And this is 1914 and 1915 we're talking about.
That's right. So Dennett gathered what was kind of a drawing room full of activists and journalists, people she had met through the suffrage movement, like Charles Hallinan and Martha Gruning. The journalist Lincoln Steffens was part of it. There is the feminist lawyer Jesse Ashley, who was also involved. And although they were called the National Birth Control League, their first priority was trying to repeal specifically the New York State Comstock laws, the male censorship laws that stopped birth control from being able to be circulated birth control information and birth control methods. But their founding documents are also really revealing because they really show how eugenics was part of the birth control movement from the very beginning. They talk about how birth control would reduce abortions, prevent the births of the unfit, a word that gets tossed around a lot, especially as eugenics becomes more popular in the next decade. They talked about combating illegitimacy, and keeping the poor off government relief, and kind of rounded that out with improving maternal and infant health. So that's kind of the nugget of the first birth control association that got started.
It's such an interesting combination. Some of it seems far-seeing and modern, and then the aspect of eugenics, of course, is worrisome, makes us feel like, wait, what are these people talking about and who are they allied with? So we'll talk more about eugenics in a few minutes, but I wanted to also ask you how the agenda of the women working on birth control either differs or intersects with the suffragist movement, because we're about to get to 1919 and the moment when the 19th Amendment passes and women get the right to vote. And there is obviously suffragist activism going on with that regard. And one might imagine that these groups would be closely allied, but that's not really the case, right?
That's right. Dennett was at the center of the suffrage movement at that time. And one thing that really frustrated her about establishment suffragists was how conservative they were. They were unwilling to talk about fertility control as a plank in their agenda. They were very focused on excluding Black suffragists from their events and from their rallies. They, but beyond asking for the vote, they really did not want to ruffle any feathers. They were fine with prevailing ideas about feminine ignorance and submission in marriage. So because the suffrage movement so actively avoided acknowledging or supporting the birth control movement, they were sort of seen as very separate. But interestingly, I think Dennett always pitched birth control as something that women would turn to after suffrage had been won. I think she envisioned that once women had the vote, a big united bloc of women would turn to birth control. That's not what ended up happening.
This episode of the Gabfest is brought to you by GiveWell. If you're someone who likes to optimize things, choosing the perfect credit card or finding the fastest route when you drive, shouldn't you handle your charitable giving the same way? GiveWell spends 50,000 hours every year doing deep dives into different charitable programs to help you do the most good for your dollar. They've now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only direct funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they found. Over 100,000 donors, including me, have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. And rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed decisions about high impact giving, so they make all of their research and recommendations available on their site for free. And when you make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, GiveWell does not take a cut. So go to givewell.org to find out more or make a donation. Select podcast and enter Gabfest Reads at checkout to make sure they know you heard about them from the Gabfest. Again, that's givewell.org to donate or find out more. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Quince. In my household during this season, there's only one word, there's only one acceptable adjective, and that adjective is cozy. Cozy is the only word I'm allowed to say in my house from about October until March. And Quince brings the cozy. So I just got some new delicious pillowcases from Quince that have made sleeping in my bed, my extremely cozy bed, even better than it's already been. I have a cozy Quince sweater that I love to wear around the house. And the great thing about my cozy Quince sweater and my cozy Quince pillowcases is that they are incredibly comfortable and delightful and beautifully made, but they cost 50 to 80% less than similar brands. And that's true for everything that Quince sells. Beautiful leather jackets, cotton cardigans, soft denim, so much more. So get cozy in Quince's high-quality wardrobe essentials. Go to quince.com/gabfestreads for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/gabfestreads to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/gabfestreads.
Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a one-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
This episode is brought to you by Skinny Pop Popcorn. Perfectly popped, endlessly delicious. Oh, so light and crunchy. Skinny Pop Original Popcorn is the snack you've been searching for. Made with just 3 simple ingredients: popcorn kernels, sunflower oil, and salt. Snacking never felt or tasted so good. Perfectly popped, endlessly delicious. Give yourself permission to snack and pick up Skinny Pop Original Popcorn today.
Hi, I'm Carvel Wallace, and on this week's Slate Advice podcast, How To, we're tackling the future of reproductive health care in the U.S., which now feels uncertain after 2024, but has been uncertain for some time. But there is one thing that is certain, which is that men need to share a greater responsibility for contraception.
This idea that there's something that's unmanly about reproductive health care means that we don't welcome men into our healthcare settings.
Look for How to Man Up about male birth control in the How To feed and find it wherever you listen.
In the fall of 1915, Margaret Sanger comes back to New York. She's gone off to Europe because she is fearing prosecution for violating the Comstock Act. You mentioned Comstock. The Comstock Act makes it a crime to send through the mail any material on birth control, or actually anything that's considered obscene, which is a broad category. So she's in trouble. She leaves for Europe. She comes back and she goes to the National Birth Control League and to Dennett, particularly expecting her support. But that's not what happens. Why does Dennett back away from Sanger at that point?
This is where the rift between them really begins. And it's a rift that is never fully repaired through their lifetimes. Dennett's response was that a close tie to Sanger, who had broken the law and fled the country to evade trial, would be detrimental to the birth control movement that Dennett had so painstakingly been trying to build. She was trying to build credibility in her lobbying work. And being closely allied to someone who is a firebrand and a lawbreaker, she predicted would reflect badly on her. And so Dennett was always convinced that existing systems would eventually work in her favor if she made her case persuasively enough. And Sanger, understandably thought that was incredibly privileged and bourgeois as a point of view. She wanted to provoke a real crusade. And to her, breaking the law was a means to an end. It was a means to publicity, to provoke test cases where the legality of birth control could be argued in court. But Dennett and Sanger never agreed on that point, even though the effectiveness of Sanger's methods ended up being proven.
Sanger provokes these early legal confrontations. She goes on trial. She gets acquitted. There are these fiery protests. She's really using this to kind of galvanize the public behind her and also educate people about birth control. And Dennett, as you say, has this more play by the rules set of ideas. And yet, interestingly, in terms of what they are seeking in change in the law, it's Dennett, right, who has the more radical view of what the law should be, and Sanger, who is being more incremental and piecemeal. Can you talk a little bit about their different approaches to legislation that would legalize birth control?
Absolutely. Sanger started out really allied with the radical socialists and anarchists like Emma Goldman in New York City. But in 1917, she changed tack pretty drastically. And she announced to her own birth control league that she had launched, called the American Birth Control League, that their primary goal was to legalize birth control so that doctors and nurses only could prescribe it. And that was quickly revised to doctors only, or the doctors only path, or doctors only compromise is what Dennett called it. And I think Sanger did this for a number of reasons. She was really pragmatic. And she saw that she would need men on her side, specifically men of science, in order to make birth control palatable to politicians. Dennett hated this compromise because she thought that restricting birth control, which meant at that time diaphragms or douches, to only accessible via a doctor's prescription would exclude poor and rural women entirely. She was against any kind of gatekeeping. Instead, she envisioned a kind of FDA-style approval process for birth control methods that came to market. So over time, this was the issue that kept them apart, that kept them from uniting and joining forces. Even after Dennett retreated from Washington and Sanger's lobbying campaign began, Dennett persistently kind of needled Sanger with letters urging her to end the doctors-only compromise, arguing again and again that it would just perpetuate paternalism in medicine and be less equitable for poor and rural women.
And meanwhile, Sanger's becoming the more powerful, dominant figure in the movement. She is charismatic. She's good at fundraising. Her incremental strategy winds up being kind of elitist, right? She's doing fancy fundraising events. And Dennett is sort of sidelined, except that she has a kind of moment in the sun of her own in 1929. She goes on trial for writing about sex ed and circulating this booklet. What is the impact of this trial? How does this change American law?
Dennett had written a sex ed booklet for her older son in 1915. It was an incredibly productive year for her. But he came home from boarding school for a visit in New York City and showed her a sex ed pamphlet that a classmate had given him. And she was appalled. She thought that it was vague, it was moralizing, It really didn't get into any useful details at all. So she wrote her own. She trawled through all the literature of sex ed and wrote and illustrated this booklet called The Sex Side of Life. And she gave it out to her children, to friends. She started selling it via mail order. It was even published in a medical magazine and was considered, the standard of accurate, progressive. It was considered like the standard of straightforward, accurate sex ed for progressive families who wanted to give their children the facts of life without actually having to talk to them about it. But in 1929, Dennett sent the pamphlet out to someone who she thought was a customer and ended up being a vice agent in decoy. Her federal indictment arrived early in 1929, and her trial went through spring of that year. She was convicted with barely any time for the jury to deliberate. I think they deliberated for 42 minutes, and she was found guilty of obscenity. The following year, she was acquitted on appeal. And what that did effectively is it changed the whole standard of obscenity for published work in the US. Before her acquittal, the standard was that any part of a text, if any part of it was deemed to stimulate sexual thoughts in an impressionable reader, then the work as a whole was obscene. Afterward, the intention of the work as a whole was taken into account. And that opened the gates for works like Married Love by Marie Stopes and even Ulysses by James Joyce to be published.
So this is a crucial development in law that helps drag the United States into modernity, right? That you can talk about sex, you can educate people about birth control, sex, physiology without getting into trouble. And it also makes way for a lot of art and literature, as you were mentioning. In 1930, I'm going to shift back to Margaret Sanger. Sanger opens the first birth control clinic in Harlem. And she does this working with Black leaders at the time, including W.E.B. Du Bois, who are very much thinking about birth control as something that they want for their communities as well. Sanger later in her life, or maybe even really more recently, has come under a lot of criticism for things that she said that are related to eugenics. But at this point, she's working with the Black community and I think in some ways trying to serve it. So can you talk about what you make of this moment in her life where she's working in Harlem before we also talk about some of the criticism of her?
Yeah, so exactly. As you said, she was invited to open this clinic in Harlem by a coalition of community organizations there. So Sanger, my view of her is, in my research, I saw that she never declined a donation from a white supremacist. She even lectured for the Women's Auxiliary of the KKK. She wrote often and enthusiastically in favor of eugenics and how birth control could support the eugenics movement. And it's hard to believe, that she wasn't a true fan. But I will say, and the journalist Imani Gandhi has written about this, her pro-eugenics messaging never dwelled on race. It was extremely anti-disability. But she did design studies and services that specifically supported women of color. And she openly disdained the pseudoscience that was being published in medical journals at that time, that argued that Black people were slow learners and shouldn't be offered contraception because they wouldn't be able to use it effectively. Sanger even wrote once that the average white woman was much more challenging to teach when it came to the technique of using birth control.
That's really interesting. So the Great Depression starts around this time, and Sanger, I think, tries to use it to get support for her cause. She does it in a way, though, by talking about relief babies and the high birth rate among poor women. And it seems to me like the mid-1930s and 1940s is when her language about eugenics starts to get really harsh and to my ear is like really hard to excuse and take in. At the same time, she is like very much a part of her era. And so I always find it difficult to know quite how to judge people when you're talking about them in their own time. So, and I was wondering, how you think about this period of her life and how you explain the really harsh terms in which she's talking about people and who should be able to reproduce. I feel like we should also remind readers this is around when the Supreme Court decides this very discredited case, Buck versus Bell, which allows for sterilization of people on the basis of fitness to reproduce, and again shows how eugenics has really permeated the culture at this point.
Yes, absolutely. So it's hard to believe now, but before the atrocities of Nazi Germany were uncovered, eugenics was incredibly popular with mainstream white authority. This was not controversial, and she was one voice among many that was talking about the benefits of promoting fit families and suppressing the unfit. So, as early as 1915, eugenics was part of the mission of the National Birth Control League. And those terms, fit and unfit, became more and more powerful in politics over the following 2 decades. So through the 1920s, immigration quotas were passed, 21 and 24. And in 27, Buck v. Bell comes along, so the state can sterilize people against their will. Sanger did always maintain that birth control was more important than eugenics, that reaching eugenics-oriented goals was not possible without access to birth control. And this, I think, is another way in which Dennett was more far-sighted. She was not anti-eugenics, but she, I think, saw that feminism would never be a plank in that agenda, that giving women control over their own fertility was very much not what eugenicists had in mind, as they were trying to boost the numbers of Nordic or Anglo-Saxon families and suppress others. Eugenicists and Sanger did have an enemy in common, which was the Roman Catholic Church. So I think that's kind of interesting. There's the only justice to oppose Buck v. Bell was a Catholic justice. And it could be also that Sanger was hoping to ally herself with eugenicists because they shared this common enemy.
Publicly, at least, Sanger continues this approach of doctors being the ones who are going to prescribe contraceptives, this like gatekeeping, more professionalized idea about who's going to control access to birth control. You make some really interesting points about how that medicalization of birth control is still with us. Can you talk a bit about why you think that her emphasis on doctors in the medical profession continues to affect how we receive and think about birth control?
Sure. I think, one really clear aspect to me was the fact that long after many countries had made the birth control pill an over-the-counter medication, here in the United States, it didn't happen until 2023. So I definitely see that as part of the legacy of Sanger's doctors only path.
Sanger and Dennett never succeed in passing a federal law that would make birth control legal. They never repeal the Comstock Act. That is one way in which the events in your book are reverberating since Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation plan for a Republican presidency, very much talks about Comstock being enforced once again, even though it's been dormant for a century. What happens instead of a federal law is that the federal courts basically change how Comstock is interpreted in a way that eventually allows birth control to become legal. And yet we continue to live in this very unsettled world in which, as you say, there are still some restrictions on how people receive birth control. And certainly the whole issue of abortion is incredibly unresolved. I should make clear that Dennett and Sanger did not publicly advocate for abortion, although they both quietly at different points helped women end their pregnancies when they needed to. When you think back on this history that you've been exploring from nearly a century ago, here are these incredibly strong women who are fighting for women's reproductive freedom and health. They're doing it within the constraints of their time. They have different ideas about political strategy. In some ways, we can judge them for their views. And yet at the same time, I wanted to know what lessons you take from them going forward in this moment for post-Dobbs America.
I think most of all, my goal was to tell this very human story of a radical cultural movement. And I hope if there are any lessons in the book, one of them is about the slowness of progress over time when it comes to reproductive rights. And the fact that our elected leaders do not have many incentives to push forward what's basically a humanitarian issue, like birth control or like maternal health. The right to birth control has really only been codified in 14 states, which starts to seem like a real problem after Dobbs, especially in light of the fact that the Right to Contraception Act, the federal law introduced in 2023, keeps failing in Congress because opponents either see it as a Trojan horse for more abortions or as totally unnecessary. So, I think one insight I hope readers take from the book is that potentially abortion is on the same road to mainstream acceptance as birth control, although it's a long, long road. I hope this history shows how much more dangerous it is when birth control, when abortion are illegal, rather than part of standard medical training and care. Also, it was so fascinating to show and to learn about and write about how birth control, how abortion have been around as long as the family itself.
Yeah, you do a really good job of making that clear. And I think you've also reintroduced us, your readers, to these two incredibly compelling characters. I really enjoyed getting to know both of them, and you tell their personal stories in a way that intersects with all their professional work. So thank you so much for this terrific book, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Stephanie Gorton's book is The Icon and the Idealist. We will be back next month with another edition of Gabfest Reads. Until then, all three of us, David and John and me, will be back in your feed on Thursday with a new episode of the Slate Political Gabfest. Thanks so much for listening.